Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Mr. Night Whisperer TT. Tonight, I invite you to travel back more than a century to a quiet New England town that never expected its name would one day echo in classrooms, protest speeches, and late-night debates around the world. This is the story of Nicholas Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, two immigrant men whose trial and execution would ignite controversy far beyond the borders of Massachusetts. But before the world knew their names, it all began with one violent afternoon in April of 1920, when a pair of payroll guards set out with money meant for factory workers and never returned home alive. I want you to imagine South Braintree, Massachusetts at that time. It wasn't Boston, far from the bustle of the city, but it wasn't rural either. It was an industrial town, its lifeblood built on factories and the constant hum of machinery. Immigrants, especially Italians, filled the workforce. Many lived in small, crowded apartments, speaking more Italian than English, carrying with them not just their labor, but their ideals, their hopes, and sometimes their political radicalism. On April 15, 1920, the Slater and Morrill shoe factory prepared for payday. Frederick Parmenter, the paymaster, and Alessandro Berardelli, a security guard, walked out of the office carrying two metal boxes. Inside them, over $15,000 in cash. Adjusted for today, that was a fortune. Their task was simple, routine, to bring the payroll to the workers waiting at the plant. It should have been uneventful. But that day, on Pearl Street, shadows were waiting. As Parmenter and Berardelli walked, two men suddenly approached them. Witnesses would later say the attackers looked foreign, perhaps Italian. A car idled nearby. Then, shots rang out. Parmenter was shot first in broad daylight, falling helplessly to the street. Berardelli, armed with his revolver, tried to resist. He fired at least once, but he was outgunned. Witnesses recalled a brutal detail. He was shot multiple times, even as he stumbled and collapsed. The attackers seized the cash boxes, sprinted toward their waiting getaway car, and sped off in a cloud of dust and panic. The scene left behind was chaos. Two men dead, money gone, and dozens of witnesses shocked by what they had just seen. But their descriptions didn't align. Some said there were 3 attackers, others 5. Some swore the men looked dark and foreign, while others weren't sure at all. And yet, in the United States of 1920, those hazy impressions were enough to plant suspicion. The country was in the midst of what historians now call the Red Scare. Fear of communists, anarchists, and foreign radicals ran deep. Only months before, bombs had exploded in several cities. Italian anarchists were suspected of being behind them. And in Massachusetts, where tensions between workers and factory owners already simmered, people were quick to connect the crime to outsiders. The police investigation began with urgency, but it lacked direction. They found shell casings at the scene, revolver bullets lodged in the victims, and the faint tread marks of the getaway car's tires. Detectives combed through immigrant neighborhoods, asking questions, following rumors. The assumption from the start was that the killers were foreigners, anarchists perhaps, rather than local criminals. One odd fact, the robbers left behind no fingerprints, no clear physical evidence tying anyone to the murders. What they left was fear, gossip, and speculation. That was enough to feed suspicion. Even before Sacco and Vanzetti entered the story, this case had already become more than a robbery. Newspapers ran headlines warning of anarchist plots, fueling the idea that foreign-born radicals were not just political agitators, but violent criminals, ready to strike against the American system itself. Scholars later debated whether this fear was rational. Were police pursuing justice, or were they hunting an idea, the idea of anarchism, embodied by immigrants who were seen as outsiders? Some historians argue that the investigation was compromised from the very start by bias. Instead of looking for evidence, police looked for scapegoats who fit a convenient narrative. But on that April afternoon, all the townspeople knew was that two men had been gunned down in cold blood, their killers had escaped, and whispers of anarchists filled the air. What strikes me, even now, is how quickly the line blurred between fact and assumption. A robbery and double murder became a political case before any suspects were named. Imagine that atmosphere. Living in a town where everyone is suspicious, where being Italian or holding certain beliefs might suddenly put you under the gaze of the police. This was not the last time fear would overshadow facts in this story. In fact, it was only the beginning. The morning after the murders, South Braintree woke to hushed conversations, headlines, and a sense of dread. The names of the dead men were now known to all: Frederick Parmenter, the paymaster, and Alessandro Berardelli, the guard. Two men whose job had been simple, almost invisible, carrying wages so that others could live, now became symbols of a violent assault on order itself. I picture Berardelli that day, revolver at his side, walking with a sense of duty that had probably become routine. When the shots tore through the street, he didn't freeze. He fought back. But his revolver, a .38 caliber, was no match for the hail of bullets aimed at him. He was hit multiple times in the chest and back, collapsing into the dust of Pearl Street. Parmenter, the paymaster, was not a fighter. Witnesses said he stumbled as soon as the attacker struck, clutching one of the money boxes. A bullet caught him in the chest as well, and he fell near Berardelli. Both men were left lying in the road, their bodies surrounded by panicked townspeople who had gathered in the aftermath. It's important to note the brutality here. The robbers did not fire a single warning shot or try to frighten their victims into surrendering. They shot to kill, swiftly, decisively, and with cold efficiency. For many who read the newspapers, that fact alone painted a picture of radicals, men hardened by ideology rather than desperation. And yet, there was no proof of that. Just bodies, blood, and stolen money. Investigators moved quickly. The two payroll boxes contained over $15,000 in cash, meant for the wages of hundreds of workers. That was an enormous sum in 1920, and it meant the killers had planned carefully. Some witnesses said the getaway car was a dark-colored Buick. Others insisted it was a Maxwell. Descriptions of the men varied even more. Tall and thin, short and stocky, dark hair, maybe clean-shaven. Inconsistent, but always tinged with a suggestion. They looked foreign. The shell casings collected at the scene were identified as .32 caliber, likely fired from an automatic pistol. Berardelli's revolver was gone, taken by the robbers, as though they wanted not just money, but his weapon too. That missing revolver would later become a piece of evidence in court. Strangely, though, the attackers had left behind other valuables. Jewelry on the victims, small items that could have been taken, remained untouched. This wasn't a random robbery of opportunity. It was targeted, planned, and ruthless. I think about the families who received the news that night. Parmenter had a wife and children, suddenly left without a provider. Berardelli, an Italian immigrant himself, was said to be proud of his position as a guard. For their loved ones, grief was compounded by the knowledge that the killers had vanished without a trace, and that justice, if it ever came, might be slow. The town buzzed with speculation. Some blamed local gangs. Others whispered about immigrant radicals, anarchists who had spoken against capitalism and the government. Here's an unusual fact that doesn't often get mentioned. Only a few months before, in December 1919, another payroll robbery had occurred in nearby Bridgewater. That case also involved Italian men, suspected anarchists, and missing money. Police immediately drew a connection, even though the details weren't the same. It shows how quickly investigators were ready to lump crimes together when ideology was involved. Scholars have long debated whether this reflex was investigative intuition or outright prejudice. Was it reasonable to think the cases were linked? Or did the fear of anarchist violence blind officials to other possible suspects? After all, armed robberies for payroll cash were not uncommon in that era. But once the words Italian and radical entered the conversation, the direction of the investigation seemed predetermined. Back in South Braintree, detectives interviewed every possible witness. The crime had happened in broad daylight. Surely someone had seen enough to help. But human memory is fragile. Some said the shooters wore caps pulled low. Others insisted they had no head covering at all. Some claimed they heard shouts in Italian. Others swore the men said nothing at all. All of these contradictions left investigators frustrated, and so the focus shifted, not on physical evidence, but on suspects who fit the political climate of the time. Police began looking more closely at Italian immigrant communities around Boston, and especially at known anarchists. It's here that the names Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti would eventually emerge, though not yet. For now, the bodies of Parmenter and Berardelli were laid to rest, while their murders remained unsolved. But in the days ahead, investigators' determination to find foreign radicals rather than ordinary criminals would set the course for one of the most controversial trials in American history. As the funerals of Parmenter and Berardelli faded into memory, the town of South Braintree still pulsed with fear. 2 men had been cut down in daylight, and the killers were still free. In a society already bracing under the weight of suspicion, the idea of faceless anarchists striking against order became the most persuasive explanation. The year was 1920, and the United States was in the grip of what history books now call the Red Scare. Just months earlier, bombs had exploded in several cities, packages mailed to judges, business leaders, and government officials. Anarchists, many of them Italian immigrants, were widely believed to be behind it. People were terrified that radicals were plotting to bring down the American system. So when the payroll murders happened in Massachusetts, the case seemed to confirm everyone's worst fears. The victims weren't just seen as casualties of a robbery. They were portrayed as martyrs of a political struggle that many believed was spreading like a contagion. Police began their search not just for criminals, but for radicals. Their eyes fell quickly on immigrant communities in and around Boston. Italian neighborhoods, in particular, became the focus. It wasn't just about who had access to guns or cars. It was about who had been speaking in public squares, handing out pamphlets, and meeting in back rooms to discuss anarchist ideas. One of the first groups to draw attention was the Galleanists, followers of Luigi Galleani, an Italian anarchist whose writings encouraged violent revolt. These men were already being monitored by federal agents. Many had been deported or were under investigation. Sacco and Vanzetti both had ties to this circle, though at this point they were just names among many in the surveillance files. The police also connected the South Braintree case to another payroll robbery months earlier in Bridgewater. That earlier crime involved a group of Italians suspected of anarchist leanings. Even though the evidence was thin, the similarity, payroll cash, daylight attack, violent efficiency, was enough to make investigators treat the 2 cases as part of a pattern. An unusual fact stands out here. The Bureau of Investigation, the early form of today's FBI, had already infiltrated anarchist groups in Massachusetts. Informants sent regular reports about meetings, names, and discussions. This meant police already had lists of suspects before the South Braintree murders ever happened. The robbery became, in a way, an excuse to act on those suspicions. But historians disagree sharply on whether this was justice or prejudice. Was it logical police work to look at anarchist circles first, given the violent bombings of the previous year? Or did the fixation on ideology blind investigators to other possible leads, like local criminals who might have targeted a factory payroll for money, with no politics involved at all? In the newspapers, The story was already framed. Headlines screamed about radical crime. Editorials warned of foreign-born anarchists plotting against American workers and businesses. The two dead men were described as loyal, innocent, and betrayed by outsiders who rejected American values. It's important to remember how much influence the press carried at that time. The narrative of anarchist guilt had already been planted before Sacco and Vanzetti were even arrested. Meanwhile, in the working-class neighborhoods of Boston and surrounding towns, ordinary immigrants lived in fear. To be Italian was to be suspect. To speak openly about politics was to invite surveillance. I imagine what it must have felt like, living in those communities, knowing that your neighbors might be watched, that police could knock on your door simply because of who you associated with. That atmosphere of suspicion and hostility created a perfect storm in which Sacco and Vanzetti's lives would soon collide with tragedy. The investigation grew more aggressive. Police raided homes, seized anarchist pamphlets, and questioned men who had been at political meetings. They weren't just looking for evidence of robbery. They were collecting names and building a picture of an underground network. And so, slowly, the case shifted from Pearl Street in South Braintree to the broader battle over what it meant to be an American and who deserved the protections of justice. Sacco and Vanzetti had not yet been singled out, but the stage was being set. When their names finally rose to the top of the suspect list, it would be less about what they had done on April 15th and more about what they represented in the eyes of fearful Americans. On May 5th, 1920, just 3 weeks after the South Braintree murders, the search for suspects finally landed on two men, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. Their arrest wasn't the result of a single piece of clear evidence, but rather of a series of suspicions that, in the tense climate of the Red Scare, seemed enough. That evening, Sacco and Vanzetti were traveling in a friend's car. The police had been tipped off that anarchists were transporting weapons, and when they stopped the vehicle, they found both men armed. Sacco carried a loaded .32 caliber pistol, while Vanzetti had a .38 revolver and a stash of shotgun shells. At the time, being armed was not unusual for working-class men, especially those who feared raids, deportations, or even vigilante violence. But in the eyes of police, it made them look dangerous, almost as if they were expecting a fight. When the officers questioned them, things quickly turned strange. Sacco and Vanzetti gave inconsistent answers about where they had been and why they were carrying weapons. They stumbled over simple details. To the police, this looked like guilt. Later, both men would claim they lied out of fear, terrified of being arrested for their anarchist beliefs rather than for the murders. In 1920, those beliefs alone could have been enough to ruin their lives. Sacco, a shoe worker, was known for being quiet, family-oriented, devoted to his wife and children. Vanzetti, a fish peddler, was more outspoken, often giving fiery speeches about injustice and the struggles of the working poor. Both were Italian immigrants, both were anarchists, and both were already under suspicion long before Pearl Street's payroll robbery. The police quickly tied them to the South Braintree case. Sacco's .32 pistol, they claimed, matched the caliber of bullets recovered from Baradelli's body. Vanzetti's revolver was said to resemble the missing weapon taken from the guard. The circumstantial evidence began to pile up. But it wasn't just the weapons. Their political identity became the central focus. When newspapers reported their arrest, the headlines weren't just about two suspects in a robbery. They were about two Italian anarchists caught carrying guns at a time when America was convinced radicals lurked in every shadow. What fascinates me is how much their ideology overshadowed the facts. Even before trial, Sacco and Vanzetti were not merely defendants. They were symbols. To the authorities, they represented a threat to American order. To immigrant workers, they were victims of prejudice. Here's a strange and lesser-known fact. On the very day of their arrest, Sacco and Vanzetti were planning to attend a meeting to raise funds for anarchists deported during the Palmer raids. They weren't hiding from politics. They were participating in it. That detail made their story even more suspicious in the eyes of the police, who believed the South Braintree robbery was part of a wider anarchist conspiracy. Historians still argue about whether their arrest was based on legitimate suspicion or on fear of their beliefs. Some point out that Sacco was carrying a pistol the same caliber as the murder weapon, and that Vanzetti's possession of shotgun shells made little sense. Others insist that police were simply waiting for an excuse to grab them, and the payroll murders provided the perfect opportunity. During interrogation, Sacco reportedly grew angry, insisting on his innocence, while Vanzetti grew emotional, pleading that they were being targeted because they were Italians, because they were radicals. Their words did not help them. The police had what they wanted: two men who fit the narrative of immigrant anarchists willing to kill. From this moment forward, the case was no longer just about the deaths of Parmenter and Berardelli. It became a trial of identity. Were Sacco and Vanzetti murderers? Or were they victims of a system that judged them first for who they were, and only afterward for what they may have done? Before we move on, let me pause here. If you've stayed with me this far, you're part of a rare circle that dives deeper than headlines. If stories like this keep you restless, craving uncomfortable truths, you might consider subscribing. But only do it if you want your nights unsettled with history's darkest echoes. And while you're here, share with me in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what time glows on your clock right now? As the investigation deepened, Sacco and Vanzetti were about to step into the most pivotal and merciless stage of their lives. When Sacco and Vanzetti were first brought into custody, the police wasted no time. Both men were separated, placed in bare interrogation rooms, and pressed for details that would either connect them to South Braintree or prove them liars. What followed revealed as much about fear and prejudice as it did about the men themselves. Nicholas Sacco, the shoe worker, was methodical but tense. He claimed he had been in Boston the day of the murders, arranging for a passport to travel back to Italy. He even insisted that he'd stopped for lunch with friends. On the surface, it sounded like a clean alibi, but when detectives asked for precise times and names, his answers grew vague. The inconsistencies gave investigators ammunition to frame him as evasive. Bartolomeo Vanzetti, the fish peddler, offered a different defense. He said he had been selling eels in Plymouth that same afternoon, going door to door, trying to make a little money. To him, it was a simple, ordinary task. But witnesses couldn't agree. Some said they had seen him, others were less certain. The uncertainty cast doubt, and the police seized on that. The strangest part, though, wasn't about where they were. It was about who they were. During questioning, both men were asked not only about their movements, but about their beliefs. Were they anarchists? Did they attend meetings? Did they support Luigi Galliani, the Italian anarchist whose followers were suspected in bombings? These questions had nothing to do with the payroll robbery, but everything to do with painting them as dangerous radicals. Here's where the story grows heavier. Sacco and Vanzetti did lie during these interrogations. Sacco denied being an anarchist. Vanzetti downplayed his political connections. Both later admitted they lied out of fear, not of being guilty of the robbery, but of being punished for their political identities. In 1920 America, an anarchist was often treated as an enemy of the state. That fear explains their contradictions. But to the police, it looked like guilt. The weapons seized during their arrest only deepened the case. Sacco's .32 pistol was the same caliber as the bullets that killed Berardelli. Vanzetti's revolver, police claimed, could have been the guard's missing gun. Whether those connections were genuine or exaggerated remains one of the most debated points in the case. Ballistics at the time lacked the precision of today, and expert testimony was often more persuasive theater than science. Still, prosecutors believed they had what they needed. A fascinating and often overlooked detail is that Sacco had recently paid into a fund to support anarchist comrades facing deportation. He was carrying a pamphlet at the time of his arrest. To his community, this showed loyalty and solidarity. To prosecutors, it proved dangerous radicalism. The very evidence that tied him to his political circle became evidence of criminal intent. Scholars continue to wrestle with this moment. Some argue Sacco and Vanzetti sealed their fate by lying, making themselves appear guilty. Others insist no amount of honesty would have saved them, because the system was already tilted against immigrant radicals. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. As days turned into weeks, the press amplified every rumor. Headlines described the men as foreign anarchists first and suspects second. Editorials painted them as symbols of the chaos threatening America's peace. Meanwhile, in immigrant neighborhoods, whispers spread that Sacco and Vanzetti were being railroaded. To their friends, they weren't criminals, they were scapegoats. Looking back, what chills me most is how quickly a robbery became a political trial. Evidence mattered, yes, but ideology weighed even heavier. Sacco and Vanzetti were not just Nicola and Bartolomeo anymore. They had become representatives of a struggle between fear and freedom, between America's suspicion of outsiders and the fragile hope of justice. The interrogations had ended, but the trial that awaited them would be far harsher than anything in those bare police rooms. By May 1921, the trial of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti opened in Dedham, Massachusetts. The courthouse was packed with reporters, police officers, and curious onlookers. This wasn't just another robbery case. It was already shaping up to be a spectacle, a battleground where politics, prejudice, and justice collided in front of a restless public. The prosecution presented its case first. They leaned heavily on eyewitness testimony, which even at the time was shaky. Workers from the Slater and Morrill shoe factory claimed they had seen Sacco and Vanzetti near the crime scene. Some said they recognized them by face, others by build or clothing. But the accounts varied wildly. One worker swore Sacco was the man running with a gun, while another insisted it was Vanzetti. A third couldn't be sure at all. Still, the jury heard the repeated refrain, "These men look like the bandits." The most damning evidence, according to the state, came from ballistics. A bullet recovered from Berardelli's body was said to match Sacco's .32 caliber pistol. The gun itself became almost a character in the trial, passed from expert to expert, held up for the jury, and spoken of as though it carried the truth inside its barrel. The prosecution argued this was conclusive. To them, the weapon tied Sacco directly to the murder. For Vanzetti, the state leaned on circumstance. He carried a revolver at the time of arrest. Police claimed it might have been Berardelli's service weapon, stolen during the robbery. No one could prove that beyond doubt, but the suggestion was enough. To the jury, the picture was forming. Two armed radicals, tied to weapons and fleeing a crime. The defense fought back. They presented alibi witnesses. Friends and acquaintances testified that Sacco had been in Boston, arranging his passport, and that Vanzetti had been selling fish in Plymouth. The defense also pointed out contradictions in the prosecution's eyewitnesses. How could so many people remember the same moment so differently? But here's where the trial tipped. The presiding judge, Webster Thayer, made no secret of his bias. He referred to Sacco and Vanzetti as anarchist bastards outside the courtroom and allowed prosecutors to emphasize their political beliefs during proceedings. The defense objected, but Thayer overruled them again and again. Instead of focusing solely on whether they committed the robbery, the trial repeatedly circled back to whether they were dangerous anarchists who threatened America. This shift mattered deeply. Juries are made of people, and people in 1921 were living in the shadow of the Red Scare. Just a year earlier, anarchists had mailed bombs to government officials and businessmen. Labor unrest was painted as a radical threat to democracy. Against that backdrop, Sacco and Vanzetti weren't just men. They were symbols of foreign radicalism. The jury, 12 Massachusetts citizens, absorbed that context whether they wanted to or not. One strange fact that emerged during the trial is that a hat found at the scene was supposedly linked to Sacco. But when tested in court, it didn't even fit his head. The prosecution still argued it was his, framing it as evidence he was there. This moment, small and almost absurd, highlights how weak evidence could be spun into damning proof under the right narrative. Academics continued to debate whether Judge Thayer's prejudice alone invalidated the trial or whether it was the combination of weak evidence, anti-immigrant bias, and political hysteria. Some historians argue the outcome was inevitable from the start, that Sacco and Vanzetti were condemned not by bullets or witnesses, but by their own identities as Italian anarchists in a fearful America. Others suggest a fair trial could have exonerated them, since no physical evidence was irrefutable. As I imagine sitting in that courtroom, the air heavy with whispers and the gavel echoing against the wood, I can see how the trial wasn't just about two men. It was about what America wanted to believe about itself: safe, orderly, and free from foreign threats. Sacco and Vanzetti, guilty or not, had become the embodiment of the fears beneath that surface. When the prosecution rested, the jury had a clear but troubling choice: judge two men for a robbery and murder, or judge them for who they were in a time of panic. When the jury withdrew to deliberate, there was an uneasy quiet. The trial had lasted weeks, with every detail picked apart, every political belief dragged into the open, and yet the central question, did Sacco and Vanzetti commit the robbery and murders, seemed almost lost in the noise. Deliberations were surprisingly short. After only a few hours, the jury returned. Their verdict was as swift as it was devastating: guilty on all counts. Both Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to die in the electric chair. The courtroom erupted. Supporters of the men shouted that the verdict was unjust. Reporters scribbled furiously, their headlines already forming: "Radical anarchists found guilty" and "Justice served." But for many, especially within immigrant communities, the trial confirmed their worst fear: that the system would never give outsiders a fair chance. The defense immediately filed appeals. They pointed to inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts, flawed ballistics, and the obvious bias of Judge Thayer. In most cases, such grounds could have at least earned a retrial. But Thayer reviewed the motions himself and denied them all, insisting the trial had been fair. That in itself raised eyebrows. A judge ruling on his own conduct was hardly impartial. Yet the law allowed it. As the months turned to years, the case transformed. It wasn't just about Sacco and Vanzetti anymore. It became a global cause. In New York, protest marches filled the streets. In Paris, demonstrations erupted outside the American embassy. Intellectuals like Albert Einstein, H.G. Wells, and Upton Sinclair publicly questioned the fairness of the trial. The case became a rallying cry for labor activists, socialists, and defenders of civil liberties around the world. Strangely, while appeals dragged on, new evidence surfaced. In 1925, another man named Celestino Medeiros confessed to being part of the South Braintree robbery. He claimed Sacco and Vanzetti had nothing to do with it. His confession was never fully investigated by the courts. Judge Thayer dismissed it outright as a desperate lie from a career criminal. But many saw it as the most credible alternative explanation for the crime. Here lies one of the most haunting scholarly debates. Did the state suppress evidence of the men's innocence to preserve the original verdict? Some historians argue that admitting error would have undermined public trust in the courts during a volatile era. Others believe the authorities truly thought Medeiros' confession was worthless. The line between justice and expediency blurred in those crucial years. An unusual fact that often surprises people is that Sacco and Vanzetti, though radicals, were not united in temperament. Sacco was fiery, convinced of his role as a martyr for the cause. He once wrote from prison that he was suffering because I am a radical. Vanzetti, on the other hand, grew more reflective. He admitted he had lied during his arrest out of fear, and he worried that the truth might never be heard. This difference in personality gave their case a strange duality. One man defiant, the other quietly tragic. Meanwhile, the public campaign grew louder. Writers and scholars framed the case as a test of America's promise. Could a nation built on freedom execute two men without fully proving their guilt? Or was it proving that justice could be bent by fear and prejudice? By 1926, the protests had reached such intensity that even the governor of Massachusetts faced international pressure. Appeals continued, but Sacco and Vanzetti remained behind bars, waiting. They were no longer just two Italian immigrants accused of murder. They were symbols, whether they wanted to be or not, symbols of justice denied or justice served, depending on who you asked. And with each passing year, the question deepened. Were Sacco and Vanzetti guilty men or victims of America's first great trial by ideology? The years stretched on, and with them, the shadow over Sacco and Vanzetti grew longer. Appeals had failed, new evidence had been brushed aside, yet the case refused to die. Each headline, each protest, each whispered conversation in factory halls or immigrant cafes kept the men alive in public memory. By 1927, the weight of the case had grown unbearable for Massachusetts officials. Governor Alvan Fuller was under immense pressure. Thousands of letters poured into his office daily. Some demanded the executions proceed to uphold law and order. Others pleaded for clemency, arguing that the trial had been poisoned by prejudice. The governor, clearly uncomfortable, appointed a special committee to review the case, a move that was supposed to signal fairness. The Lowell Committee, led by former Harvard President A. Lawrence Lowell, examined the evidence. Many hoped this would finally bring a balanced review, but in the end, the committee upheld the convictions. Their report concluded the trial had been fair, dismissing all concerns of bias. Critics immediately labeled the review a whitewash. To this day, scholars debate whether Lowell, a man of Boston's elite, was ever capable of delivering a verdict that contradicted the establishment he belonged to. Meanwhile, Sacco and Vanzetti themselves became more outspoken from prison. Letters they wrote to supporters were smuggled out and printed in newspapers across the globe. Their words, especially Vanzetti's, carried a haunting mix of resignation and defiance. One of Vanzetti's most famous statements came shortly before the end. I would not wish to a dog or to a snake, to the most low and misfortunate creature of the earth. I would not wish to any of them what I have had to suffer for things of which I am not guilty. That letter in particular struck a chord. People read it not just as a defense of innocence, but as a cry against the machinery of injustice. It turned Vanzetti into something larger than life, a man who, in suffering, spoke for countless others silenced by the system. The protests peaked that summer. In London, workers marched by the thousands. In Buenos Aires, demonstrations clogged the streets. In Berlin, banners with Sacco and Vanzetti's names hung across city squares. The case had become a global litmus test. Where did you stand on justice, prejudice, and the power of the state? Yet inside Massachusetts, the machinery of law kept grinding. Appeals exhausted, clemency denied, the date was set. August 23rd, 1927. The night of the execution drew a crowd of thousands outside Charlestown State Prison. Some gathered to pray, others shouted angrily at the authorities. Soldiers were stationed nearby in case of riots. Inside, the prison buzzed with the grim precision of preparation. Guards tested the electric chair, making sure it was ready. An unusual fact from that night, Vanzetti was offered a final meal, and he declined almost everything, asking only for a glass of tea. Sacco, by contrast, ate heartily, perhaps in an act of defiance, as if to say the state could not take his spirit, even in his final hours. Before being led to the chair, Vanzetti addressed the courtroom in what became his most famous statement. He declared, "I am innocent. I never committed any crime. I wish to forgive some people for what they are doing to me now. I wish to pardon some people for what they are doing to me now." Witnesses later described his voice as calm, steady, almost unnervingly composed. Sacco, too, cried out as he was strapped into the chair, shouting, "Viva la anarchia!" His final words were not of fear, but of rebellion. Both men, in their last moments, cemented their transformation from obscure immigrants into enduring symbols. When the switch was pulled, silence fell over the prison. The executions were carried out swiftly, one after the other. Outside, the crowd erupted in rage and grief. Some fainted, others screamed. News of the executions spread instantly across the globe, igniting protests that lasted for weeks. Scholars have long debated whether the state's determination to proceed with the executions, despite mounting international protest, was a show of strength or an act of weakness. Was Massachusetts proving its independence from foreign pressure, or exposing its fear of admitting error? This debate lingers even now, nearly a century later. That night in 1927, though, it was not about philosophy or politics. It was about two men strapped to a chair, sparks snapping in the dark, their lives extinguished while the world watched. Before we continue deeper into the aftermath, let me ask something of you. If you're finding this story unsettling but also compelling, consider subscribing and liking this video. It helps more than you realize. And I'd love to know, what part of the world are you listening from right now? And what time is it there as this voice reaches you? Share it in the comments. I always find it fascinating. After the executions, Massachusetts fell into an uneasy silence. The authorities may have hoped that putting Sacco and Vanzetti to death would finally close the case, but in reality, it only magnified the controversy. Within hours of their deaths, vigils and protests erupted across the world. In Boston, thousands gathered as their bodies were transported to the funeral home. The procession that followed remains one of the largest in the city's history. Over 200,000 mourners lined the streets to pay their respects. Many were ordinary working-class immigrants who saw in Sacco and Vanzetti reflections of themselves. Men who had crossed an ocean in search of opportunity, only to be swallowed by a system that seemed designed to crush them. The funeral itself was an overwhelming sight. Coffins draped in red and black cloth, colors associated with anarchism and workers' struggle, were carried through the streets. The smell of flowers mingled with the sweat of the summer crowd, and banners with slogans like "Justice Crucified" waved above the procession. Photographs taken that day show a sea of faces, tense and defiant, as if the entire immigrant community had decided to stand shoulder to shoulder in protest against what had happened. What often surprises people is that the American press covered this massive funeral with striking restraint. Some papers dismissed the mourners as radicals or agitators, while others acknowledged the sheer scale of grief. But few could ignore the power of the image. Two men condemned as criminals, receiving the kind of farewell usually reserved for heroes. Outside the United States, the reaction was even more intense. In Paris, students clashed with police in the streets, outraged by what they saw as judicial murder. In Buenos Aires, dock workers went on strike, declaring the executions an attack on all working people. In Tokyo, protest meetings drew large crowds, and in Moscow, the Soviet government used the case as proof of capitalist injustice. The men had become martyrs on a global scale. At the same time, the American establishment stood firm. Judge Thayer gave a speech shortly after the executions in which he mocked those who had protested. His comments deepened the resentment against him, painting him as cold and arrogant. Many legal scholars later argued that his conduct alone undermined confidence in the verdict. The scholarly debate that endures from this period revolves around the meaning of martyrdom. Did Sacco and Vanzetti willingly accept their roles as symbols, or were they simply two individuals swept into a storm larger than themselves? Some argue Sacco, with his fiery words, embraced the identity of a political martyr. Vanzetti, on the other hand, seemed reluctant, reflective, almost mournful about being cast in a role he never asked for. The contrast between them remains one of the most haunting aspects of the story. There's also a strange and unsettling fact. Pieces of their clothing and even locks of their hair were preserved by supporters as relics. These items were treated almost like sacred objects, carried through rallies, displayed in union halls, and held up as proof that their memory could not be erased. It blurred the line between political activism and something closer to religious veneration. As weeks turned into months, the case began to fade from the daily news cycle, but its echoes never fully disappeared. Writers published books, scholars penned essays, and plays were written about the men. The controversy entered classrooms and lecture halls, forcing students to grapple with questions of justice, prejudice, and the power of the state. The state of Massachusetts, however, showed no sign of regret. Officials insisted the executions had been lawful and just. To them, the case was closed. But for the millions who had followed the story, nothing about it felt settled. The memory of Sacco and Vanzetti became less about what they had done or not done, and more about what America had revealed about itself in trying them. And as history would prove, the ghosts of Sacco and Vanzetti would continue to haunt not just Massachusetts, but the entire world. By the late 1920s, the immediate shock of the executions had passed, but the legacy of Sacco and Vanzetti refused to disappear. They had become symbols, not only of immigrant struggle, but of the fragility of justice in a system under pressure. In the United States, the cultural debate split sharply. For some, particularly within conservative circles, the executions were proof that the law would not bend to radicals or anarchists. They argued that Sacco and Vanzetti's political beliefs, while not technically on trial, could not be separated from their actions. To them, the guilty verdict was both legal and moral. For others, however, the trial had exposed a rot at the core of American justice. Writers, intellectuals, and labor leaders argued that the executions were the result of prejudice, not proof. They believed the men had been convicted not because of what they did, but because of who they were. Poor, foreign-born, outspoken in their politics. This rift in perception became part of a much larger conversation about America in the 1920s. It was an era of upheaval, prohibition, racial tensions, labor strikes, and a growing fear of communism. Sacco and Vanzetti were no longer just defendants in a single case. They were part of the larger narrative of America's struggle with identity. One of the stranger details that emerged during this period involved Judge Thayer. In 1932, just 5 years after the executions, he survived an attempted bombing of his home. The blast injured his wife and housekeeper, but left him unharmed. The attack was never officially solved, but it was widely assumed to have been carried out by anarchist sympathizers seeking revenge. The judge lived the rest of his life under heavy guard, a reminder that the case had created scars not easily healed. Scholars still debate whether Thayer's hostility during the trial was personal or political. Some say he despised Sacco and Vanzetti simply for their anarchist views. Others believe his disdain reflected a deeper fear, that America itself might be destabilized by radicals if the courts appeared weak. Either way, his role has become one of the most scrutinized aspects of the case, a symbol of how bias at the bench can shape an entire verdict. Meanwhile, Sacco and Vanzetti's memory spread far beyond the courtroom. Plays, poems, and songs were written in their honor. Artists painted their faces, playwrights dramatized their final words. The case became not just history, but mythology. In union halls, photographs of the men hung beside banners demanding justice. In classrooms, debates about their innocence became lessons on fairness, democracy, and the dangers of fear-driven trials. An unusual fact is that their ashes were divided after cremation, some sent back to Italy, some kept in the United States. Supporters saw this as symbolic. The men belonged both to their homeland and to the new world they had chosen. It also reinforced the way they had become larger-than-life figures, claimed by multiple causes and nations. Decades later, the case would still spark arguments. Historians pored over ballistics reports, eyewitness testimonies, and the details of Celestino Madero's confession. New forensic techniques eventually suggested that Sacco's gun might indeed have been used in the South Braintree shooting. Yet doubts remained. Was this definitive proof of guilt, or the result of flawed evidence handling from the 1920s? No answer has ever fully satisfied both sides. And perhaps that is the most enduring feature of the case, its uncertainty. Sacco and Vanzetti are remembered less for what can be proven about them, and more for what cannot. They represent a moment in history where the line between guilt and innocence, justice and injustice, blurred so completely that the truth itself seemed out of reach. Before we move deeper into the decades that followed, let me pause here. If you're still with me in this long and winding story, take a second to tap the subscribe button, but only do it if you feel ready for more nights filled with uneasy truths and voices that linger in the dark. And while you're here, share something in the comments. What city are you in? And what's the hour on your clock right now as you listen? As the decades unfolded, Sacco and Vanzetti's story refused to fade. What struck me most when retracing these years is how their trial seemed to grow larger after their deaths than it ever had in life. Their names became shorthand for injustice. For immigrants, workers, and radicals across the world, they represented proof that the promise of America could betray you if you didn't fit the mold. In Italy, their homeland, memorials sprang up. Streets were renamed after them, and their portraits were carried in labor marches. For the Italian-American community in the United States, though, the memory was more complicated. Many immigrants feared that identifying too openly with Sacco and Vanzetti might invite suspicion in an era still hostile to radicals. Yet quietly, in family gatherings and community halls, their story was passed down, generation to generation, as both a warning and a point of pride. In American culture, the case became a constant reference point. Novels and plays retold the events with varying emphasis, some painting the men as innocent martyrs, others as guilty but sympathetic figures. Even in music, their names appeared. Folk singers like Woody Guthrie and later Joan Baez immortalized them in songs, turning their struggle into melody. It is rare for a criminal case to echo so loudly through the arts. But Sacco and Vanzetti seem to inspire endless retellings. A fact that fascinates many is how the FBI quietly monitored public opinion about the case long after the executions. In the 1940s and 1950s, agents collected reports on labor rallies where Sacco and Vanzetti's names were invoked. The state, it seemed, was still uneasy about the power of their memory decades later. This paranoia demonstrates just how deeply the case had unsettled the establishment. Scholars often debate whether the men's enduring fame came from the injustice itself or from the global movement that formed around them. Would the world have cared if two obscure Italian immigrants had been executed quietly? Or was it the protests, the literature, the songs, the speeches that transformed them into icons? Some argue the movement created the myth. Others insist the myth only reflected the deeper truth, that they were condemned unfairly. One chilling anecdote, often overlooked. In 1941, Benito Mussolini himself briefly considered using Sacco and Vanzetti's legacy for propaganda. Italy under fascism wanted to present America as hypocritical, persecuting its immigrants while claiming to be a land of freedom. It never became a centerpiece of Mussolini's rhetoric, but the fact that even dictators recognized the case's symbolic weight shows how powerful it had become. By the 1960s, during the civil rights era, the story found new resonance. Activists drew parallels between Sacco and Vanzetti and contemporary cases of racial injustice. Their names were invoked in speeches, articles, and campus protests. For younger generations, they were not simply historical figures, but part of a continuing narrative about fairness and prejudice. And then came the 1970s, when the state of Massachusetts finally revisited the case. Governor Michael Dukakis issued a proclamation declaring that Sacco and Vanzetti had been unfairly tried and convicted, that any disgrace should be forever removed from their names. The declaration was not a legal pardon, but a symbolic act, an acknowledgement that the trial had been tainted by bias. For some, it was too little, too late. For others, it was a long overdue gesture of honesty. This official recognition also revived academic debates. Was Dukakis acknowledging that they were innocent, or simply that they hadn't received a fair trial? The distinction is subtle but important. To this day, historians remain divided. One camp convinced Sacco was guilty, Vanzetti less so, another arguing both men were scapegoats. What I find most unsettling is that the ambiguity persists even with modern forensic analysis. Forensic tests in the 1980s seemed to link Sacco's gun to one of the bullets. But the chain of custody, the way evidence had been handled since 1920, was too compromised to inspire certainty. Evidence can't be trusted when decades of mishandling have passed. The truth remains suspended, unreachable. As I speak this, I imagine you listening in the dark, perhaps wondering how such an old case could still stir so much unrest. And that, I think, is the essence of Sacco and Vanzetti's legacy. Their story is not just about what happened in Massachusetts in 1920, but about the questions we keep asking ourselves a century later. What is justice? Who gets to claim it? And can a system truly be fair when prejudice seeps into its foundation? By the time the 20th century moved into its final decades, Sacco and Vanzetti had become less like men and more like myths. Their faces appeared in murals, in textbooks, in songs sung at protests that had nothing to do with Massachusetts or even the United States. Somehow, their trial and deaths had been absorbed into a much larger human story, one about outsiders facing the full weight of fear and prejudice. The academic debates only deepened. Historians pored over trial transcripts, police notes, and witness statements, pointing out glaring contradictions. Some emphasized that eyewitness testimony, already unreliable, had been contaminated by the chaotic lineup procedures. Others focused on the ballistics evidence, insisting that even if Sacco's gun had been used, the handling of bullets and weapons during the investigation was so sloppy that nothing could be trusted. A strange fact, the original evidence, the bullets, the revolvers, the reports, was stored for decades in Massachusetts archives and periodically brought out for retesting. Generations of forensic experts from the 1920s to the 1980s all examined the same handful of items. This meant that Sacco and Vanzetti's fate was tied to physical objects that aged, degraded, and passed through countless hands. The trial lived on, in part, through these artifacts. But beyond the forensic debates, the story carried moral weight. For many, Sacco and Vanzetti symbolized the dangers of letting ideology cloud justice. Their anarchist beliefs had terrified authorities in 1920, when bombs were exploding in cities and fear of radicals was at a fever pitch. The trial, some argue, became less about the murders in South Braintree and more about punishing a worldview that threatened the status quo. This idea, that they were convicted not for what they did, but for what they believed, remains one of the most powerful critiques of the case. Scholars in law schools still use it when teaching about due process and the dangers of bias. The case has become a permanent cautionary tale in American legal history. In the public imagination, Sacco and Vanzetti continued to inspire. Plays were staged in Europe, poetry anthologies included verses in their honor, and student groups in the 1970s and 80s revived their memory during campus protests. They had transcended their own story. They had become icons of dissent, invoked wherever people felt the law was being used as a weapon against the powerless. Meanwhile, Massachusetts officials remained cautious. Even after Governor Dukakis's 1977 proclamation, there was no formal exoneration. The state never declared them innocent. Instead, the line was carefully drawn. The trial was unfair, but the guilt or innocence of the men remained unresolved. That ambiguity, intentional or not, has kept the case alive. And here is the haunting reality. Ambiguity may be the reason we still talk about them. Cases with clear endings fade, but cases that leave a door half open, a shadow unresolved, become eternal. I sometimes wonder if Sacco and Vanzetti themselves sensed this. Vanzetti, in particular, seemed to know he was becoming a symbol. His letters reflect a strange awareness that his death would mean more than his life ever had. Sacco, more fiery, seemed to embrace the role of martyr. Between the two, their personalities shaped the myth, one quiet and tragic, the other defiant and political. Before I lead you into the final stretch of this story, let me pause here. If you've stayed with me this long, perhaps this case has lodged itself in your mind the way it has in mine. Do me a favor. Press that like button, but only if you want more stories that linger in your thoughts even as you drift off to sleep. And while you're here, tell me, what's the first thing you'll do tomorrow morning when you wake up? I'd love to see your answers in the comments. By the late 20th century, Sacco and Vanzetti were more than names in a trial transcript. They were case studies, taught side by side with Dreyfus in France and Scottsboro in Alabama. In lecture halls, professors asked their students, "What do we really mean when we talk about justice?" The story had become a lens for examining how courts balance evidence, ideology, and fear. A peculiar fact: every August 23rd, in Boston's North End, small groups of people still gather to hold vigils in their memory. It's not a state holiday, not a formal event, just clusters of activists and locals standing with candles where Italian immigrants once crowded into cramped apartments. These vigils have lasted for decades, a kind of living memorial that blurs the line between history and ritual. The scholarly debate remained sharp. Legal historians often frame the Sacco and Vanzetti case as a paradigm of judicial error, while others countered that the courts did, in fact, follow the rules of the time. This raised an uncomfortable question. If the trial was legal by 1920 standards, yet unjust by today's, what does that say about our evolving concept of fairness? Is justice timeless, or is it always tethered to the era in which it's dispensed? For immigrants, radicals, and working-class communities around the world, the case resonated in personal ways. To them, it wasn't just about Massachusetts or 1920. It was about being watched more closely because of an accent, about having assumptions piled on top of one's name. The lesson was intimate, not abstract. In the United States, the case often resurfaced during moments of political unrest, during the Vietnam War protests, during the Civil Rights Movement, during debates over the death penalty. People invoked Sacco and Vanzetti as reminders of what could happen when the government silenced dissenters. Their photographs, unsmiling in grainy black and white, appeared on placards in marches where most people had long forgotten the shoe factory robbery that started it all. That is the strangest irony of all. The original crime, the South Braintree payroll robbery, faded almost entirely from memory. The victims, Parmenter and Berardelli, became footnotes. Sacco and Vanzetti eclipsed them, not because of what they did or didn't do, but because their trial embodied something larger. The narrative shifted from two men accused of murder to two men sacrificed to fear. And so, more than a century after the gunshots in Massachusetts, the debate is still alive. When I read court transcripts late at night, I find myself asking the same questions people asked in 1921. Did they do it? Was the evidence enough? Did Judge Thayer let prejudice guide his rulings? Or were Sacco and Vanzetti simply unlucky to be radicals in an America that had no tolerance for radicals? As I close this section, I'll leave you with one last thought before we move into the final chapter. Injustice has a peculiar power. It does not always fade with time. Sometimes it sharpens, gaining clarity as decades pass. Sacco and Vanzetti's trial is proof that a story can outlive its century, haunting not because of what we know, but because of what we may never know. If this story has kept your thoughts quietly circling tonight, consider subscribing. I promise more journeys into cases that challenge the very idea of truth. And before you drift off, tell me, do you believe history is capable of delivering justice or only memory? We've walked together through courtrooms, prison cells, and the crowded streets of Boston. But as the case of Sacco and Vanzetti reaches its final stretch, I can't help but reflect on what makes it endure. Most trials from the 1920s lie dormant in law books, forgotten except by specialists. Yet this one, despite being rooted in a modest robbery and 2 lives lost, became a touchstone for global debates about fairness, prejudice, and the power of the state. A curious fact, in the 1970s, a committee of historians in Massachusetts examined whether the state should grant a posthumous pardon. But legal experts pointed out something strange. Pardons are traditionally for the guilty, an act of forgiveness. To pardon Sacco and Vanzetti would be to imply guilt. What their defenders wanted was exoneration, but that wasn't how the law worked. This technicality is one reason the case remains suspended in ambiguity. Academics continue to circle the same unresolved question. Can we ever know the truth? Some argue that with lost evidence, fading memories, and decades of political spin, the case has slipped beyond the reach of certainty. Others insist that modern forensic analysis of Sacco's pistol points strongly toward guilt. Still others counter that even if Sacco fired the gun, the fairness of the trial was so compromised that guilt no longer matters. The scholarly debate has shifted from did they do it to what does it mean when justice is tainted at its core. And maybe that's the essence of this case. It's not just a legal puzzle, it's a moral mirror. It forces us to ask, how much does fairness matter in a courtroom? Is it enough to be technically correct, or must justice also feel just to the society it serves? Cultural echoes of Sacco and Vanzetti still ripple outward. The mural in Boston's North End, the songs by Woody Guthrie and Joan Baez, the vigils each August, all of these carry the trial forward into new generations. The men themselves might be gone, but their silhouettes keep walking alongside us, invoked whenever the legal system seems more concerned with order than with truth. By now, perhaps you can feel the pattern. Stories like this rarely resolve neatly. They keep us unsettled, not because they leave us without answers, but because they leave us with too many. As you listen in the quiet of your room tonight, maybe you feel that lingering tension too. The sense that justice is never as simple as guilty or not guilty. Maybe that's why the story of Sacco and Vanzetti remains with us, drifting like an unfinished sentence through the corridors of history. We're nearly at the end now. In the final part, I'll step back and show you why this case matters not just to historians, but to anyone who's ever felt the weight of judgment, fair or not. But before that, if you found yourself pulled into this century-old case, let me know with a comment below. Do you think justice should be judged by the standards of its own time, or should it always be measured against timeless ideals? The final page of this long, unsettling journey brings us back to Massachusetts, back to that heavy August night in 1927, when two men, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, walked toward the electric chair. They were executed, their deaths framed as justice served by the Commonwealth. Yet, as history has unfolded, the question has never been about the sparks of that chair, but about the doubts that hovered over every step of the process. The legal verdict was clear, guilty of robbery and murder. The punishment was absolute, death by electrocution. But outside those prison walls, the sentence was never fully accepted. Protests raged, not just in Boston or New York, but across continents. Demonstrations in London, Paris, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, all demanded mercy, all claimed injustice. Rarely had a case of two immigrants from Italy ignited such global outrage. Decades later, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts faced its own reckoning. In 1977, Governor Michael Dukakis issued a proclamation declaring that Sacco and Vanzetti had been treated unjustly and that any disgrace should be forever removed from their names. But note carefully, this was not a formal exoneration. It was an acknowledgement of unfairness, not a legal reversal. That careful wording itself shows how tightly justice and politics were woven in this case. Even today, scholars split sharply. Some insist that Sacco, at least, was probably guilty, citing ballistic evidence. Others argue that both men were innocent, scapegoats of a fearful era. And a third group claims the real legacy lies not in guilt or innocence, but in how fear, prejudice, and political hysteria can warp the scales of justice. To me, that may be the most unsettling part of all. When the system decides not on what is proven, but on what is feared, then no one is safe. And that truth, whispered through this century-old case, is what makes Sacco and Vanzetti still relevant today. The case ends here, but its questions remain. Did two anarchist immigrants die for a crime they didn't commit? Or did they meet a punishment that matched their deeds? History offers no neat answer, only shadows that stretch across time. And now, as we close this story, I want to slow down with you. Imagine the Boston streets quiet after the protests. Picture the dim cell where Sacco and Vanzetti spent their last hours, one writing letters, the other praying softly. The world has moved on, but those moments are still suspended, like dust caught in a shaft of light. This story has been long and maybe heavy, but you've stayed with me, and together we've carried the weight of it. You can let it go now. Allow the unease to drift into the background, like a faint echo of history that no longer demands your attention. The case ends here. Sleep well, everyone.